So after Mercedes forgot what good strategy was in Mexico 2 weeks ago, it was time for the penultimate round of the season. Yeah, look at me with the fancy words. But for round 21 we were headed to Interlagos for this year's Brazilian Grand Prix, a race that had played host to so many title deciders over the years. Just a shame it's not this one, given Ferrari only turned up for the first half of the season, and Mercedes, well, not really at all. Over in the standings, and the battle was heating up for 4th place, with McLaren just 7 points behind Alpine, helped out in Mexico by Daniel Ricciardo deciding to actually turn up for just the second time in 2 years. Along with Fernando Alonso's Alpine proving itself to be so unreliable, it could rebrand as a McDonald's McFlurry machine. Hey guys, it's Taron and welcome to the On Track channel and to round 21 in Brazil. Before we get into it, just a quick little reminder that if you are enjoying these videos, do make sure to give it a little thumbs up, and don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications for some more. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into my honest review of Formula 1 and the 2022 Brazilian Grand Prix. So, following on from Brazil, there was the post-race debrief from Mercedes, in which they explained how they'd taken data from Nicholas Latifi when deciding to put their cars on the hard tyres in Mexico. Which is kinda like finding someone else's homework to copy, except that kid is by far the worst in school, and you also knew it was theirs, and yet you still copied it. Talking of Latifi, and after being dropped by Williams earlier this year, he was talking about his future for next season, with the Canadian saying that the easy choice would be to head over to America and compete in a series like IndyCar. Nicky, I know it's IndyCar, but it's still a professional racing series, not just a charity for rehoming useless pay drivers. Over at Alfa Romeo and for Valtteri Bottas, it was announced he'd be taking part in the 2023 Race of Champions in Sweden. I'm no expert, but you know, Valtteri, champions, come on. And finally, in Las Vegas, there was the launch for next year's race, with donuts from Checo and some from Lewis Hamilton as well, along with George Russell, who in his usual fashion was just sort of crashing into things. Into the action then, and Max Verstappen was picking up from exactly where he left off last year, going deep and then running wide at turn 4, but without a Mercedes on his outside this time. Over at McLaren, and after missing Thursday with suspected food poisoning, Lando Norris was back in his car, and wasted no time getting in the way of Carlos Sainz as he exited the Senna S, with Carlos on the radio complaining how he'd been given reprimands for way less than that. Come on Carlos, you don't seriously expect consistency from F1 now, do you? Over at Aston Martin, and Lance Stroll was just doing Lance Stroll things. Those things being going slowly and getting in the way, as he parked his Aston in front of Leclerc's Ferrari. Now normally, nobody cares about the final times in FP1, unless your favourite driver is at the top of course. But as this is a sprint weekend, and this was the only session before qualifying, it had Sergio Perez leading the way just 4 thousandths ahead of Leclerc, 8 thousandths ahead of Verstappen, and the top 6 separated by just 2 tenths. On to qualifying, and with rain between sessions, it was an intermediate start, before Pierre Gasly made the switch to softs and then everyone else made the switch as well. Some not quite as quickly as others, with Ferrari just leaving Leclerc chilling on his jacks without tyres. Meanwhile, at the sharp end, and there was a surprise face, as F1's Canadian bank had made his way into P1, until order was resumed and he was back down into the drop zone, which, as it turned out, was the place for champions to be, with Verstappen and Hamilton both sat in that drop zone after the checkered flag, the pair managing to make their way through into Q2 with the final few laps of the session. Into Q2 then, and to take advantage of the inconsistent conditions, it was new softs for everyone. Everyone except Mercedes, who went with the used sets from Q1, meaning their lap times were as competitive as the Lakers this year. And so they put on new softs to improve their times and get out of the drop zone, along with Carlos Sainz, who found himself potentially in a bit of trouble at one point. And that turned out to be important, given there was just enough rain at the end of the session to be nobody else was improving, leaving both Aston Martins out of qualifying along with Albon, Gasly and Ricciardo. On to Q3, and everyone was eager to get out on their soft tyres, except Charles Leclerc, who Ferrari had put on intermediates because, well, they're Ferrari. And so Leclerc went around the track so slowly you'd think he was Nicholas Latifi. At which point George Russell decided he hadn't had enough attention so far, and went off at turn 4, through the gravel, started to YOLO some donuts, and then got himself stuck. Which brought out the red flags, and given it was starting to rain, sealed everyone in their places, with Leclerc P10, Perez P9, Hamilton in P8, the Alpines in 7th and 6th, Sainz, then Norris and Russell in 3rd, Verstappen P2, with Kevin Magnussen in P1 and on pole position for Saturday's sprint. So take note, Mick Schumacher, That Haas car does actually have some pace. Into FP2 then, and the most notable thing was down at Williams, as Logan Sargent was in the car for an FP2 session, not just FP1, as the team were trying to give him an extra super license point, which may come in handy as they have him down to replace Nicholas Latifi for next season, with the Canadian providing a handy reminder as to why that's the case, as he went off at the final proper corner and turned his Williams into the world's most aerodynamic lawnmower. Not gonna lie, that Williams car is probably more effective as a lawnmower than it is an actual F1 car. But that was basically it for the session, with Esteban Ocon sat on top of the times, with the sprint race up next. On to the sprint, and everyone was on softs except Verstappen on the mediums, probably the ones he used in Mexico, with Mercedes still waiting for them to drop off. At lights out though, and Kevin Magnussen held the lead into turn 1, with Verstappen keeping ahead of Russell in behind. Further back and it was on to Alpine, with Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso seemingly taking over the role of clown circus from Ferrari, with the two side by side through turn 4 and Fernando being squeezed out and nearly colliding with his teammate, with the pair of them deciding to save the colliding for the end of the lap. As along the main straight, Fernando forgot that once you're in the slipstream, you need to move out of it and just drove into the back of Ocon. I know he's getting up there in age, but it may be time for Fernando to book a trip to Specsavers. Talking of blind racing drivers, and Lance Stroll was drawing all the attention, as he did pretty much exactly what he did in COTA, this time forcing Sebastian Vettel off track and onto the grass. Looks like it's the wrong Canadian driver that's leaving at the end of the season. Meanwhile, as that was going on, we were busy not watching a change for the lead, thanks to some completely useless TV direction, as Max Verstappen had taken the lead from Kevin Magnussen, ending Haas's laps led at just 3. Luckily though, they did show the battle that followed between Russell and Hamilton, with George attempting to get the switch back at turn 4 after pulling alongside the Red Bull on the back straight. He was unsuccessful, and so went again, this time getting by before the corner with the assistance of DRS and taking the lead at the sprint. And while that battle was on, it brought Sainz and Hamilton into play, with Sainz the first to make a move, diving up the inside of turn 1 with Max making contact with the Ferrari and breaking off his front wing end plate, which then combined with the slower medium tyres made him vulnerable to Hamilton as well, with Lewis breezing by on the main straight and slotting into P3 behind Sainz and Russell, which is exactly how the sprint would end, with George crossing the line to take his maiden F1 win, sprint win so not quite the same but a win nonetheless, and for anyone that missed that in that last clip, yes, that was Nicholas Latifi nearly being lapped after just a 1/3 distance race. On to Sunday, and the Mercedes pair held off Red Bulls into turn 1, with Russell keeping the lead from Hamilton behind. Meanwhile, over at McLaren, and they were providing some action, with Norris diving up the inside into turn 1 and getting past the Ferrari of Leclerc in the process. Meanwhile, in the other McLaren, less progress and more of an F1 game of tag, with Ricciardo clipping the rear of Kevin Magnussen, who rolled backwards and collected Ricciardo, with both of them out of the race. This of course brought out the safety car, and after a few laps of being stuck going slowly behind an Aston Martin that somehow wasn't Lance Stroll, we could get racing again, with George catching Lewis napping, leaving the Red Bulls right on his tail into the first turn, with Verstappen going round the outside of Hamilton at turn 1 and then through him at turn 2, nearly perfectly recreating the incident from 2018 where Esteban Ocon did, well, pretty much the exact same thing. And for this, Verstappen received a broken front wing along with a complimentary 5-second penalty from the stewards. And believe it or not, after all that meant he would be sat behind Nicholas Latifi, it still wouldn't be the low point of his race. Meanwhile, back on track, and Lando Norris was doing all he could to keep Charles Leclerc behind. This included yeeting the Ferrari into the barrier through turn 6, which meant he too received the gift of a 5-second penalty. And for Leclerc, well, his race was somehow not over, as the front end of his Ferrari had suddenly decided to make itself indestructible, and so he continued, after pitting for a new wing and being relegated back behind Latifi and Verstappen. After that though, the race sort of settled, with Russell in the lead extending his gap to Perez behind, along with Hamilton, who dropped back to 8th, making his way back up into the top 4. Meanwhile, for Ferrari fans, if things weren't already bad enough, it was about to get worse. Feel like I've been saying that a lot this year. As from 3rd place, Carlos Sainz was forced into an early pit stop due to a visor tear off getting caught up in his brakes. And while it left his right rear tyre as the site of a temporary barbecue, it more importantly forced him onto a 3-stop strategy, meaning it wasn't for another 8 or 9 laps before the other leaders of Russell and Perez came in, along with Hamilton just a little later, who was slowly putting himself back into contention, with the Brit a little later on going from P4 to P3 as he got past Checo on the main straight and down into turn 1. With that overtake done though, it was a case of letting all the gaps play out with all of the top runners except Sainz having made their final stops. At which point up stepped Lando Norris, or more specifically his McLaren, which thought it would spice things up a bit. Doing so by dying in the middle sector, which brought out the virtual safety car, and given the McLaren was as reluctant to move over as Max Verstappen, it became a full safety car, during which the cars that had been lapped, also known as Williams and friends, are allowed to unlap themselves, unless your name is Yuki Tsunoda, with race control sticking a big middle finger up at the Japanese driver and just completely forgetting he existed, meaning at the restart he went to the back of the pack, a lap down and dropping like a stone. And dropping like a stone was something that Sergio Perez was about to experience, given the team elected to keep him on the medium tyres against everyone else on softs, losing out to Sainz, then to Leclerc, then to Alonso, and then finally being told not to fight teammate Verstappen, with Max being let through on the basis that if he didn't catch Alonso, he'd give the place back to Checo to help him try get P2 in the championship. And come the final straight on the final lap, Alonso was still ahead, and so the order came through. The response from Max?
No.
Which went down with the F1 fanbase about as well as the time Haas announced Nikita Mazepin as an F1 driver. Meanwhile though, and back up at the front, the two Mercedes cars were clear of the pack, with George Russell even more clear, maintaining the lead all the way to the line and crossing it to claim his first ever Grand Prix win in Formula 1, also meaning he has an infinite percent more wins than Lewis Hamilton this year. Anyways, that's all for now, thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe for more F1 content, but until next time, take care.